Bom dia a todos e todas que nos assistem. Hoje a gente abre o primeiro encontro do segundo eixo do Seminário Internacional de Governança da Internet, uma atividade da Escola de Governança da Internet. Esse eixo contará com 2 mesas de debate, uma hoje e a outra na próxima quinta-feira, que abordarão os temas que surgiram em torno do desenvolvimento da infraestrutura da internet e o seu reflexo na governança da internet. Hoje a gente gostaria de agradecer a presença do Bertrand de la Chapelle e do Milton Miller, que aceitaram o nosso convite para estar aqui nessa mesa, e também do professor Flávio Wagner, que vai ser o moderador desse debate. O Flávio Wagner é presidente do capítulo brasileiro da Internet Society, ex-conselheiro do CGI.br por 3 mandatos e coordenador do Fórum da Internet no Brasil por 4 edições. É professor titular aposentado do Instituto de Informática da UFRGS, onde ainda atua como colaborador e foi presidente da Sociedade Brasileira de Computação por 2 mandatos. Professor Flávio, muito obrigado por ter aceitado o nosso convite. A gente dá boas-vindas e gostaria de dar abrir essa mesa de grande sucesso. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Thank you to the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee for the invitation to moderate this very important session. And good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this new session of the International Seminar on Internet Governance, which is being organized by the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee. This panel today will discuss challenges to the governance of the Internet infrastructure, how the borderless Internet is being threatened by fragmentation and shutdowns. In this debate, the disputes around geolocalization of the network and the Internet connectivity model, which is independent from national borders, will be put in evidence. As a closely related question, the legitimacy of the current arenas that govern the Internet infrastructure and protocols will also be discussed. The panel will address how claims for digital sovereignty from nation states and geopolitical disputes around technology affect the governance of the Internet infrastructure and critical resources. And for this discussion, the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee invited 2 international experts on matters of Internet governance, fragmentation, and digital sovereignty, Bertrand de la Chapelle from France and Milton Miller from the USA. We are very thankful to them for having accepted this invitation and for sharing with us their expertise, insights, and proposals for the way ahead. We shared with them 2 initial questions. First, is a unique, secure, and resilient Internet a technical or a political challenge? And second, do threats of fragmentation and shutdowns indicate a new technical and political arrangement for the further Internet governance and development? So I am very honored to serve as moderator of this panel, and it's a real privilege to have this opportunity to interact with Bertrand and Milton in the discussion of these topics. But before I introduce our panelists and ask them for their initial contributions, let me share with you some initial thoughts that will help us shape the scenario for this debate. One of the fundamental topics of Internet governance is the management of its critical resources, which concern elements of the network infrastructure, such as domain names and IP addresses, and the technical protocols that enable communication between connected devices. The goal in these processes has always been to keep the Internet open and to allow an easy connection of new networks to it, while remaining unique and resilient. However, this goal is challenged by transnational disputes involving sovereignty claims and geopolitical issues around technology. If Internet governance is considered by some to be a post-Westphalian global social contract, because the flow of data is not guided by national borders, at all times those borders reclaim their legitimacy in the cyberspace. One of the consequences that may result from this conflict between the open Internet and national borders is the pulverization or possible fragmentation of the network. In the terms defined by Milton Miller, one of our panelists, there is a new alignment that nation states are demanding in regard to the Internet. In practice, the Internet is made up of a myriad of autonomous interdependent systems. The process of fragmentation or balkanization, however, refers to the process of building barriers, controlling transnational data flows, imposing disconnections or shutdowns, and a host of other interventions that were not foreseen by the technical design of the network by its pioneers. In the IANA transition process, during which the management of critical resources was widely discussed, and which ended in 2016, the global internet governance system had a moment of great concern in a context of uncertainty about the future of the supervision of the root zone and generic domains. The initial rules in the transition process already established beforehand that the form of management would change some of its parts, but would barely modify the actors that would be involved in this management. The experiment was successful in completing the transition process, but offered not much novelty in the representation of governmental actors, for example. The dispute for legitimacy of arenas that discuss the network infrastructure and critical resources is a good gauge of where these controversies are not yet resolved. As an example, the current proposal for a new protocol for the internet, which was preliminarily called New IP, may shift the technical debate about the technical evolution of part of the network to the ITU, which is dominated by national governments. In part, this seems to demonstrate that the multi-stakeholder spaces of governance of critical resources might have found their limits. According to the Internet Society, this new proposal could make network management more costly and duplicate initiatives, disregarding all the efforts already made to create standards and recommendations and to give legitimacy to technical decisions that shape the Internet development. In the same vein, when it comes to network resiliency, there are initiatives that run counter to the Internet distributed and decentralized data routing model. Russia, very recently, conducted a major test to have all its international data traffic routed to only a few points in its territory. This was not an isolated test, but rather the result of legislation passed to set up a national network, with the justification of protecting the country from cyber attacks. In the press, the news circulated as an attempt to disconnect the country from the internet and establish its own network. The action raised, of course, a discussion about the influence of local legislation on the technical management of the network. In addition, nowadays, there are increasing numbers of temporary, partial, or total internet shutdowns that are implemented by national governments within their territories. According to Access Now, about 33 countries faced some kind of internet shutdowns in 2019 alone. These cases have increased significantly over the years, especially during periods of elections or internal conflicts, which indicates that the practice of shutting down a network is part of the attempt by national governments to control countries' internal problems, even if this affects freedom of expression and access to essential services available on the internet. Brazil, from our side here, has already faced moments of partial blocking of applications and websites stemming from court decisions. What stands out from these situations is that internet resiliency is put to the test whenever a portion of society is left without access to the network. In addition to the challenges related to the management of critical resources, there are new challenges caused by the growing relevance of fighting internet misuse. Governments react to real or perceived problems such as hate speech, disinformation, cybercrime, and excessive power of digital platforms by proposing legislation and regulations that, with the declared intention of protecting the public interest of their societies and economies, bring new risks of internet fragmentation. Increasingly, governments proclaim their digital sovereignty of their countries to justify measures that go against the classical design principles of the internet. Many proposals in this context can cause real damage to the internet infrastructure, such as combating DNS abuse through interference in the DNS itself. Another example is the proposal to weaken encryption as a means of fighting cybercrime and child abuse, without the proponents being able to understand the risks both to applications and services and to the infrastructure layer, which depend on strong encryption. For a proper analysis of the challenges posed around the management of infrastructure, critical resources, and protocols, it is therefore important to discuss, on the one hand, whether the multi-stakeholder governance model is still appropriate or needs to be improved, and, on the other hand, how demands for digital sovereignty and new legislation and regulations may affect the internet technical layers and violate its fundamental principles, potentially bringing technical, economic, and social losses. In this context, this panel brings together two experts that have a very long trajectory in the international internet governance arena. They have been deeply involved in the debates surrounding all these themes: the management of internet critical resources, the challenges imposed by jurisdictional issues which are related to the relationship between the borderless internet and the borders of the Westphalian nation states, the risks of fragmentation imposed by growing claims for national digital sovereignty and by shutdowns, the challenges to the multi-stakeholder model of governance when faced with growing pressure from governments with regards to issues such as cybersecurity and platform regulation, and the quest for new global architectures for internet governance and digital cooperation. So, with this introduction, let me now introduce our two panelists. Milton Miller is professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Public Policy in the US. His research focuses on the political economy of the internet, including property rights, institution, and global governance in the communication and information industries. He was one of the founders of the Internet Governance Project and co-founder of the Non-Commercial Users Constituency of ICANN, and has twice served as its chair. He was elected to ICANN's GNSO Council and has worked on various task forces and working groups in ICANN. He also served on the Advisory Council of the Public Interest Registry, which manages the .org top-level domain. He is the author of very influential books in the area of internet governance, such as Ruling the Root, Internet Governance and the Taming of Cyberspace from 2002, Networks and States, The Global Politics of Internet Governance from 2010, and Will the Internet Fragment? Sovereignty, Globalization and Cyberspace from 2017. Bertrand Lachapelle is co-founder and director of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. Between 2002 and 2005, he actively participated of the World Summit on the Information Society, WSIS, which promoted the dialogue between civil society, the private sector, and governments. Later, from 2006 to 2010, he was France's thematic ambassador and special envoy for the Information Society. In this position, he participated in all WSIS follow-up activities and internet governance processes, including in particular the Internet Governance Forum. Bertrand was also a director on the board of ICANN from 2010 to 2013, and he was also the vice chair of ICANN's Governmental Advisory Committee. So, our panel will be organized as follows. Our two guests will have 15 minutes each for their initial presentations. Then we will have 2 or 3 successive additional rounds of discussion where they will react to questions from each other, from me, from the audience, and we'll have up to 10 minutes for each respective intervention. So now let's move to the initial presentations of our two distinguished guests. So Milton, the floor is yours. Please go on.
All right, thank you. And Flavio, you did such a good job of introducing the problem, this conflict between the technical and the political, that I will try to sort of set the frame for what I want to say as quickly as possible so that we can get to the interesting interactions between myself, Bertrand, and you, and hopefully the audience as well. So yes, it's about the clash between technical capability and political institutions. There's a mismatch between the global connectivity of the internet and the basic authority structure of modern governance, which is organized around territorially fragmented nation states, which are sovereign within these territories. So what happens when you're using the internet, or when you're participating in the internet? You're using an open source protocol that nobody owns, such as TCP/IP or HTTP. These protocols were established by transnational standards organizations in which any individual can participate, regardless of whether they represent a nation state or not. You get recognized as a network and given a unique ID and IP addresses by a globalized non-governmental registry system organized on a regional basis. And you connect with internet service providers in the rest of the world using BGP, another one of these protocols that developed by international, transnational, non-governmental organizations that does not recognize national boundaries per se. It recognizes other networks. And then you name your websites and your domains and your email addresses using a domain name space whose root and basic policy decisions are made not by national governments or intergovernmental treaty organizations, but a multi-stakeholder organization organized as a California nonprofit. So this is a major change in the authority structure of information and communications technology. Now, for the first 10 years of the internet's commercialization and growth, the global connectivity entirely outran the capability of governments to control it. But after the year 2000, and especially with the World Summit, which, by the way, is where I met Bertrand, governments began to try to catch up and change this. They tried to assert a kind of conservative traditional order around the notion of sovereignty. And in fact, Brazil's government, or at least its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if not its NIC-BR, was a leader of this process of sort of challenging the nature of ICANN as a mechanism for making global public policy. And unlike less democratic states, Brazil was sort of open to the idea of multi-stakeholder governance on a transnational basis, but they did make a valid point that the ICANN system, with its supervision by one nation state, namely the United States, was not really realizing that ideal of a civil society-driven, private sector-driven form of transnational governance. But it was the Snowden revelations that triggered the contemporary debate about fragmentation. Many of the people involved in that saw the revelations as an open admission that the US dominance of the internet and its infrastructure was being used for military and intelligence advantage, thereby participating in the rivalry among nation states and the battle and struggle for power. So the whole idea of a free and open internet took a serious hit. Some responded with calls for data localization policies, others with vague calls for technical sovereignty or a national internet, and we're still playing that scenario out. The response, of course, from the defenders of the internet was that they were proposing to fragment or balkanize the internet. So then we started to have an interesting debate about what the heck we mean by a fragmented internet. And there was a lot of confusion about that, and that's why I wrote my third book, trying to sort this out. So fragmentation, as we now see it, cannot really be understood as a technical phenomenon. It's about that tension, that very deep and historically important mismatch between political institutions and the capabilities of information and communication technology and the semi-autonomous institutions that we built around those technologies. Not only is Internet Protocol still the world's dominant data communication protocol, but we actually see it expanding to all kinds of new devices and new services. In fact, we're so stuck in the original Internet Protocol that we are having a hard time upgrading to IPv6, a newer version of the protocol with a larger address space, which we, of course, badly need. So alignment, not fragmentation, is the correct term for what's happening. And by alignment, I mean the attempt to make authority over internetworking match up with the authority over legal jurisdictions at the national level. In fact, it's impossible for cyberspace to be carved up into sovereign spaces without one of two bad things happening. One of the bad things would be that you have digital islands in which every government has its own little space that they rule absolutely as a sovereign, but they're not connected to anybody else. The other option is that the sovereigns go into competition and one of them wins, and we have a global sovereign, a global government, a hierarchical government over cyberspace. And as you may have guessed, I'm not a fan of either one of those scenarios, and I imagine most people involved with the internet are not either. But now we see this problem. When I originally conceived of alignment, I thought of it as being, nation-state alignment, and there are, of course, almost 200 nation-states. But I think this problem is going into a new phase. It is turning into a competition between the world's three major power blocks, that is to say, the United States, Europe, and China, and each is trying to assert some kind of dominance or sovereignty over cyberspace. That is to say, we are getting the competition over sovereignty to see who will be supreme, and it's taking place between these three larger blocks, three economic and political blocks, the Europe, the US, and China. And don't ask me yet and where that leaves South America or Latin America. So Europe is trying to assert sovereignty by passing laws with extraterritorial jurisdiction. The GDPR was the most obvious example of that, and in fact the most welcomed, because it established a kind of uniform standard for privacy, which we badly needed. But now Europe is taking this farther. They think that they were very successful with GDPR, and they're trying to establish extraterritorial jurisdiction over platforms, data governance, and digital services. One of the most interesting changes they're instituting is the Network and Information Security Directive, the second version of it. And that's interesting because it is actually asserting authority over root servers, which is something that I thought we had sort of transcended with the IANA transition. And frankly, I don't think the Europeans actually know what they're doing when they do that. They are thinking that they're supporting cybersecurity by imposing regulations on root servers because they are name servers. And they don't seem to understand that the security of the root server system is something that can be taken care of by the root server system operators themselves and the ICANN regime and the people that it is accountable to, namely the actual domain name registries and registrars and users. And they don't really need to intervene in this, but that's a whole different story. Even more complex and interesting is the US-China rivalry that is emerging. Under the Trump administration, the United States crossed a line that it had never crossed before. Essentially, it abandoned its prior role as the leader and chief defender of global cyberspace and a liberal trading order within it. And they began to be nationalistic and in some ways mimicking the neo-mercantilist policies of the Chinese themselves. And I don't think I need to tick off too many of the elements of that, but you've probably heard about the restrictions on capital investment by Chinese internet firms in the United States. You've heard about the blockage of TikTok and WeChat, although those failed. They were an interesting indication of how far things could go. There is also, and most significantly, the export controls on integrated circuit technologies, which is pushing this competition even beyond the internet itself to the core technologies of information and communication. And this is a very serious attack on the coherence and uniformity of the international system. And one of the more, of course, it's not like the Chinese are completely innocent. Of course, they have been engaging in extensive forms of cyber espionage against the United States. They have blocked the access of US information service firms to their market for a combination of economic and political reasons. They have fairly restrictive data localization laws and cloud regulation acts, which are essentially trade barriers to the free flow of information and services in the internet economy. But now there's an interesting new development, and that is the idea of a Chinese cryptocurrency, which is designed, in effect, to undermine what has been, in effect, a U.S. monopoly, or at least U.S. dominance and hegemony over the international financial system. And we should all realize how much political power derives from the control of the financial system. So, for example, when we implement sanctions and try to control the behavior of other countries, it is our dominance of the financial system and the worldwide acceptance of the dollar as the common currency that makes that enforceable. So if China is actually developing a cryptocurrency which is designed to be an alternative financial system to the one led by the United States, then we really are finally talking about not only alignment as a form of fragmentation of the internet or balkanization. We are literally talking about two potentially different systems of political economy, which would inevitably produce incompatibilities and barriers to communications and information around the world. So to wrap up, we are in a process of securitizing and nationalizing global cyberspace. It is not a problem imposed on us by bad authoritarian governments. It's an extension of the very nature of national states and the sovereignty system. And it is undermining all of the amazing gains that the growth of the global internet made. And it was subordinating those gains to the power gains of national governments, and particularly the three world large power blocks of Europe, the United States, and China. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Bertrand.
Thank you very much, Milton, for your very nice perspective of relating the internet disputes to the really important geopolitical issues of our time. So, Bertrand, now it's the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Flavio, and I very much enjoyed the presentation by Milton. I want to start with one comment that Wolfgang Kleinwächter made some time ago, basically saying we used to have technical problems with political dimensions. We now have political problems with technical dimensions. And I think this answers pretty well the challenge that we're confronted with. I would be remiss if I didn't organize my comments in the traditional three-part that I'm famous for. So I want to say three things. One, we have lost 18 years in sterile debates. Two, we're now in a legal arms race that actually nobody can win. And the third one is that we need a new approach and we need a paradigm shift to address the real issues rather than being obsessed by some of the wrong debates. So Milton is absolutely right. There's a natural tension between the cross-border technical nature and the patchwork of national jurisdictions. And actually, what is fragmented is the political landscape. This is the architecture of the international system. We have separate sovereignties on the basis of territoriality. And so the real question that has been lingering for many years now is the role of governments. And the key question is, do national laws apply to the internet? And yes, of course, national laws apply to the internet, or what people do on the internet. And I want to reiterate the distinction that I often make between governance of the internet as the infrastructure and governance on the internet. But the question is not whether the laws apply. The question is, how do they apply? Because precisely it's difficult to manage common spaces. In the case of the World Summit on the Information Society that Milton mentions, there is this wonderful bit of sentence in the definition of internet governance, which those who have followed this process know very well, is the famous "in their respective roles." And I've always argued that actually there are different stages when you develop governance frameworks, an agenda setting, drafting, validation, implementation, and enforcement or review. And for me, it has always been clear that the respective roles of the different actors, the government, civil society, and the private sector, do vary according to the type of issue, the stage of the discussion, and the venue where the discussion is taking place. And what is more important is that Milton has mentioned several times the notion of the Westphalian architecture. I think we are in a situation of crisis because precisely, just like Galileo's telescope showed that the Ptolemaic system was not actually working because the things that were seen through the telescope didn't match the model, we are now in a system where basically the Westphalian architecture is critically challenged by the architecture of the internet and the fact that the decisions that are taken in one country intentionally in extraterritoriality or unintentionally have an impact on other countries. And so that is in stark contradiction with the principle of the separation of sovereignties and the non-interference in other affairs. The problem is that we are stuck with this debate of what is the role of governments. Should they be superior, or should there be one stakeholder among others, or should there be just a side afterthought? And I want to mention, Milton was talking about Europe, China, and the US. It's fascinating that in India, I bought a wonderful book that's called Data Sovereignty, and it's called The Pursuit of Supremacy. And this battle is all about this. It's about bringing back supremacy and the supreme authority of governments. As I said, we have lost 18 years since the WSIS because the debates are absolutely going on exactly under the same messages and arguments. And Benedicto Fonseca has been well placed to understand by chairing twice the working group on enhanced cooperation to see that the debate has not moved an inch in 18 years. Now, the second element is that we're in a legal arms race and the tensions are clearly rising. And the reason is that we have discovered that actually what people do on the internet is, in real life, the internet is not a Garden of Eden. There's no happy land where everybody is going to be, the lamb and the lions are going to jump happily together. The internet is just a reflection of what humanity is. And of course, there are problems. There are abuses because it's human nature. And we have moved from a period in the early 2000s, from a tech euphoria where nothing could go wrong, to a sort of tech backlash where the internet is the cause of all problems, as if it were not humans who are the cause of the problems. And also the unbalance in the economic distribution of power among companies to the benefit largely for the US and China is triggering a certain number of concerns. That being said, we have to recognize that there are legitimate concerns, and we can make the whole list. Milton has mentioned some, and I completely agree. There are issues about cybersecurity. There are issues about hate speech. There are issues about privacy. And these are legitimate concerns. And whether we like it or not, governments have, or are supposed to have, maybe they don't fulfill it all the time, but they do have a responsibility to protect their citizens. The problem is that the traditional international instruments are completely insufficient. They are not, when you think about it, the international intergovernmental architecture is fundamentally based on the principle of non-cooperation. And anybody who has participated in international negotiations knows that the only moment when governments are really able to cooperate is when their back is against the wall and the situation is so dire that they have to work together. And even so, as we see with the pandemic and climate change, this is not even sufficient. So what we're witnessing at the moment is a legal arms race where uncoordinated actions and measures only make the problem harder to solve. there's a competition between states, but there is also a competition between the states and the major internet companies today. And this is intensifying, because mistrust is growing, also because the actors are not talking to one another. Unfortunately, there's no way to address the problems that are the problems of the digital society without cooperation, and without cooperation between the different actors in various formats. And this situation reminds me of the 30 Years' War in Europe in the 17th century, where basically during 30 years, the two camps, for Protestants and Catholics, were convinced that they would win in the end. And they continued to the exhaustion and to the destruction of the whole infrastructure and massacres that are beyond pale and that have never been replicated before since then. And I believe that strongly we're in the same situation at the moment. The governments between themselves and the governments against the companies believe that in the end they will prevail. And what might be the casualty is actually the technical infrastructure of the internet and the benefits that it has brought to everybody. And if we step back a little bit, I want to share one quote from Vint Cerf, who in one of our conferences that we organized at the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, he said that organizing the coexistence of the diversity of national laws on the cross-border internet is probably more complex than inventing it in the first place, which, coming from him, is a pretty strong statement. And so I strongly believe that organizing the coexistence of billions of people online and billions or millions of different governance structures is actually a civilizational challenge. And Milton knows very well the quote that has been mentioned often from Kofi Annan in 2004, who said that basically in dealing with the governance of the internet or on the internet, we need to be as creative as the ones who invented it. And this is bringing me to the third part, the looking forward. Because I want to encourage us to shift a little bit the debate. And I know that it is moving a little bit away from the infrastructure per se, although Flavio has mentioned the question of data flows. And what I want to highlight is that the real issue is actually data. And what is at stake is the governance of what could be called the data sphere. And this data sphere, which is the entirety of the data that is being produced and that underpins all human activities today and reflects increasingly human activities, is going to be the major challenge. We, as Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, just released today, in the context of a conference that we co-organized with Japan, a framing report. The title is, "We need to talk about data, framing the debate between free flow of data and data sovereignty." And what is happening at the moment is that we are in the presence of a strong polarization around those two concepts. And data or digital sovereignty is becoming a rallying cry by a lot of governments. Although, to be honest, I don't think a lot of people understand exactly what is meant by that. And that's exactly what the report is highlighting. I encourage you to have a look on our site. The measures that are adopted under the label of data sovereignty or digital sovereignty, very often they're trying to address legitimate concerns, but they are using a very territorial-based notion of sovereignty, for instance, data localization. And what is worrisome is that they have unintended consequences that I will not elaborate on. We all know that there are unintended consequences. But the boomerang effect is also potentially biting the very actors who are adopting those measures. And this is not perceived enough because these are complex dynamic systems and people are not familiar with the dynamics of complex systems. But most importantly, a lot of the measures that are being envisaged at the moment are sort of makeshift attempt at patching something that is an obsolete international architecture. And as I said, we see in the pandemic and with climate change that actually it sometimes prevents the necessary international cooperation. And so we need a new approach in that regard. And I suggest that one of the ways to address this that we can discuss further is to ask what are the rules regarding who sets, who implements, and who enforces the rules over the data sphere. That is the right question. We need, and I've said that in a few occasions before, but more than ever, we need something that I would call a sort of governance protocol to organize the interactions between governments, companies, and civil society groups to ensure legal interoperability between these actors. A little bit like HTTP, HTML, and TCP/IP ensured interoperability between heterogeneous databases or different autonomous networks. I think this is an angle that is worth exploring because it somehow diminishes the importance of the issues that we are focusing on too much at the moment and tries to go to the root cause. Instead of addressing the symptoms, and most of what Milton has described is a real challenge, particularly regarding extraterritoriality, which may be necessary in some cases, but has a lot of unintended consequences as well. But I think it is a way to look at the problem in a more holistic manner. Looking at the governance of the data sphere is actually an exciting and quite positive task. Because to finish, the way we will govern the data sphere, the way we organize the debate around this with sufficient nuance, the way we look at real innovation in terms of governance will determine the kind of digital society that we build and the kind of digital society we'll live in. And so all the issues that we have to address are very relevant issues. There are a lot of concerns at the moment, but we shouldn't lose time, shouldn't be distracted by individual issues, and look at a larger picture, which I suggest is, among other things, to look at the governance of the data sphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. And this interesting notion of a civilizational challenge that we are facing now. I mentioned in my introduction that maybe the multi-stakeholder model of governance was facing its limits. But it's interesting to see also from this other perspective that maybe the Westphalian nation-state idea of jurisdiction and territoriality and sovereignty is also facing its limits when we deal with the internet. Interesting challenges for these days. So I don't know, Milton, if you would like to react to some of Bertrand's comments, or can we move to other questions? Would you like to react now?
I'll make a few comments. I think the one thing I want to pick up on is that Bertrand is now talking about the data sphere rather than internet governance. And I think we're both grappling with this kind of shift of gears, if you will. I do not want to call it the data sphere. I think that, again, that sort of fetishizes data. I'm beginning to more and more look about this as a using the tools, the conceptual tools of cybernetics. That is, if you read some of the early work of the people who developed the science of cybernetics, it was about communication and control in the animal and the machine. And they soon started realizing that this concept of cyber governance, it's all about governance, right? It's about information controlling things, that this applied to society, to law, to institutions as well. And they they never did a very good job of analyzing the way institutions work, although they got there. But if you look at contemporary cybernetics literature, it's all about governance. And of course, data and who controls and how it flows is part of the picture, but so are networks and so are machines. And when we look at the competition between the US and China, for example, suddenly we're talking about who controls the intellectual property underlying integrated circuits. And we're talking about who has the best database for training artificial intelligence. Yes, that's about data, but it's also about processing, and it's about networking and all of those things together. So I think we do need to take a broader look at that. And the other thing I'd respond to is, have we reached the limits of multi-stakeholderism and of the Westphalian system? And the answer is yes to both questions. I think part of the problem is that our governance system said our feedback mechanism is going to be voting. We're going to have territorially defined populations that are going to express their preferences, sometimes in the market, sometimes by voting. And we now know that that's a very bad way for global coordination. It's not working. And I think we have indeed outstripped the limits of both multi-stakeholderism because of its scalability properties. We can't really do everything the way we do the GNSO and ICANN. And,
I see what you mean.
And we can't have voting, either both, a bunch of different fragmented nation states voting or some gigantic global election. It's just inconceivable. So let's take it from there.
Flavio, if I may,
go on, Bertrand.
Two things that Milton has mentioned. One, I could not agree more with the connection with cybernetics and the fact that we are confronted with complex dynamic systems, and the institutional architecture of the international system is an extremely simple one. When you think about it, you have just 190 countries, a very simple mapping of little patches of land, and one representative that goes to an international conference. I've been one. I mean, I know what it is. How on earth can one single representative represent the diversity of perspectives of 1.3 billion Chinese or hundreds of millions of Americans, etc.? It's an architecture that is very good for non-cooperation, for preventing tensions, for potentially creating a space to avoid war. But for building cooperation, it's vastly inadequate. The second point that I want to make, and I didn't mention that in the talk, when Flavio, you ask about is something we passed or is it obsolete? I want to make an analogy. In the physical world today, we still use Newtonian physics on a daily basis. If you build a bridge, you use Newtonian physics. You don't need anything else. But if you launch a satellite at a certain velocity, you need relativity. And I believe that this analogy is a perfect illustration of a paradigm shift that is not a full replacement of one by the other. We're not going to abandon national sovereignty. But the reasoning is, if the exercise of national sovereignty only concerns the country, the territory, the people in the country with no spillover effects, traditional notion of national sovereignty. The moment, and it's increasingly the case today when we deal with the internet, the moment you have a measure at the national level that willingly or unwillingly impacts other countries or people in other countries, then you need to exercise a degree of responsibility that is not part of the arsenal of national sovereignty normally. And I want to finish with one thing. I've always been very interested in the whole debate about the World Summit on the Information Society with the term and the famous Article 35 that says governments have sovereignty over policy for the internet. They have rights and responsibility for international public policy. And I've always interpreted this as meaning that, yes, there are rights for governments in international policy making, but there is a level of responsibility that did not exist in the traditional architecture, and that is now right in the middle and front and center of the discussion.
So, thank you, Bertrand. So you are speaking about the WSIS process and cooperation and how cooperation may be possible in the current context. And one of the outcomes of the WSIS process was the IGF. The recent final report of the high-level panel on digital cooperation, which the United States convened in 2019, proposed to transform the IGF into a strengthened IGF Plus with an expanded role to address digital cooperation issues that go even beyond the strictest internet governance concepts. Do you both think the IGF Plus opens a new opportunity for the multi-stakeholder model? Can it be the right forum to discuss current not only internet governance challenges, but also by digital cooperation challenges brought about by, for example, the phenomenon of digital sovereignty, the things we are talking here about, the desire of governments to regulate many aspects of the internet and jurisdictional challenges? Or is it inevitable that such challenges will increasingly migrate to intergovernmental forums? Can we find a middle ground between these two solutions, one that preserves the multi-stakeholder model but meets the demands that may be fair from governments? And closely related to this, given these challenges we are facing now, do you think that the international internet governance community will be able to propose global standards, or at least best practices, that can really, on one hand, avoid the fragmentation of the internet, and on the other hand, create an harmonization of regional or national laws? Is it already possible to see, for instance, concrete harmonization results coming from the Internet and Jurisdiction Project, for instance, or also from the various norms proposed by the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace? Or is it still too early to see those outcomes? So, Milton, you may start.
Yes, that's a very complicated question, a very good question, one we should be thinking about. But let me try to piece it out. So what about the IGF? I'll talk about that. And then you're talking about deeper forms of, I guess, new multi-stakeholder governance that would somehow bridge the gap between current forms of the current organic institutions of internet governance and the nation state system. So with respect to the IGF, I think you have to understand, and here I feel I'm very glad that I'm like a professor of public policy and I study collective action and institutions and economics and all of the incentives around which people do rational action. The IGF will never be anything more than a discussion forum, and it was created to be a discussion forum, and it's been doing that. It could be done better. I mean, there are, everybody knows how bad the general sessions of the IGF are and compared to the workshops, and how boring they are, and how they tend to settle on very anodyne kind of themes that, motherhood and apple pie and global goodness, and we're all going to be sustainable and blah, blah, blah. But there's a lot of good networking and discussions that go on there, and that needs to continue, but it's never going to be more than that. There isn't, and the reason has to do with agency and with bargaining. So people, let's say you are a platform, you control $1 billion industry, is selling advertisements and various other kinds of information services. Now, who are you going to negotiate with in the IGF that you really are going to make concessions, or who is going to have hierarchical power over you to force you to do certain things? The answer is probably nobody at the IETF or the IGF. Maybe your national government, maybe a foreign political bloc of some kind is going to have the leverage over you to make you do something regulatory-wise that you don't want to do, but it's never going to be the IGF. So then how do we transform institutions to make them global and not nation-state based? And I think this is an evolutionary process. I think part of it is already happening. You know, we have things like ICANN. Why does ICANN work? You know, it works not just because it's a multi-stakeholder institution represents different stakeholder groups and is non-sovereign. It also works because it has contractual authority over the root. So if you want to participate in the root with a top-level domain, you have to follow ICANN's contractually negotiated rules, and that's how they have authority. And then we can have negotiations and representation and policy making around what those rules are, but you still have to have that leverage, which the IGF does not have and never will have. I'll leave it at there. Let's see what Bertrand has to say. This is a very interesting conversation, could go on in multiple directions.
Yeah, just thank you, Milton and Flavio. When we organized the third global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network in Berlin, I was really elated to see in one of the rooms, a quote by Elinor Ostrom, who was somebody that I respect tremendously. And the quote said, the purpose of public policy, I'm paraphrasing probably, the purpose of public policy is to build institutions that bring out the best in humans. And this resonates with the question of incentives that Milton has mentioned. And now to answer your question, Flavio, when the report of the UN Secretary General panel came out on digital cooperation, we were organizing as INGPN 2 consultations for 2 events, one in Latin America and one in Africa, actually, with Latin America and Africa, ECLAC and African Union. And in partnership with Germany, we introduced a dedicated session to discuss the 3 models that were proposed by the report: the IGF Plus, the so-called CoGov, and the third one, which was Commons. And the message that came out very strongly from those discussions was very simple. It was, there's not enough coordination between the different entities in the international system, be it in the United Nations system or with other actors. But most importantly, it is important to combine things and not to bet exclusively on the IGF Plus. Because what is described as a very fuzzy notion of the CoGov, which is a networked approach, is much more taking into account the initiatives that people are taking. On their own, it can be to create local IGFs, but it can be to go further, like what we're doing modestly in the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, is just to plant the flag. And I think it resonates very much with what we're all striving for, which is to have something that is more networked, to take a word that Milton has strongly pushed forward, approach. And I would say that in policy making, I take a strong inspiration from the notion of permissionless innovation. That is the foundation of the internet. I think we need permissionless policy initiatives, that you don't have to wait, like in any international organization, for 2 years or 3 years of discussion before the bureau of the international organization gets the agreement by everybody that an issue can be put on the agenda, where usually it's too late to begin to address it seriously. The possibility for actors to just gather the relevant stakeholders around a topic without any authority, except the desire to produce a better solution and submit it to who can actually implement them, is a little bit like the development of protocols and standards in the technical architecture. We need policy standards. And I'm completely aware, and Milton would be naturally spotting this, that all topics cannot really function in this way, because there are cases where there is a real tension that requires to be solved by power struggles. But there are a lot of things that can be improved, and in particular in reducing the mistrust between the different actors. I will give you a very concrete example without naming names from our process. The simple notion that companies could recognize that they have received a request by law enforcement in another country to access data in a criminal investigation or to take down a particular piece of content. The very notion that they could just acknowledge the reception of a request is an incredibly small step, but that could have a tremendous improvement in the relationship between the different actors. So there's a whole range. And again, I would like to highlight not only the IGF+, which is an interesting evolution, but taking into account the whole ecosystem of actors who can plant the flag, pick a topic, gather the stakeholders, and make them really think about what could be done better. And if it is a good policy standard, I think it will be picked up, translated in legislations, and translated in terms of service of the companies, which, as you all know, is a large part also of the norm-setting power that companies have today. So that's my answer. And the multi-stakeholder model is just the underpinning, I would say more the multi-stakeholder approach is more the underpinning of this permissionless policy initiatives approach and networked governance that I think we are all looking for.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts. But is this not the role of the policy incubator, for instance, in the IGF Plus model? That kind of policy networks of people thinking about the same problem and trying to come up with solutions that could be then offered to governments or companies
but I think what Bertrand is saying is that anybody can do that now. They don't need to have the blessing of
for sure.
Some international organization. So Bertrand is creating a policy network around the jurisdiction problem. We are trying to create one around sort of US-China relations. Other people are doing it around other things. And I think this is a very serious analytical problem with many of these discussions of the evolution of multi-stakeholderism, is that they overestimate the need for formalized collective action, and they underestimate the role of markets, just people transacting and evolving things, and they underestimate the role of informalized governance networks that form spontaneously in response to existing problems.
I would confirm and go in the same direction. There is a very strong distinction between the function and the institution. The function of incubation is absolutely fundamental, and it is really good that the report and of the panel has spotted this thing. The notion that, on the other hand, there should be one incubator is absolutely no, because let's be honest, if that were the case, we would have one incubator for all the startups, and if you are not accepted in this incubator, oh my God, you cannot, no.
You set in motion a power struggle over who controls the incubator, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm very happy if there are initiatives like incubators that spread, but there's one thing that is missing from the general discussion, which is what is the venture capital for policy? Because the development of policy initiatives in the way I was mentioning it should go through the same kind of stages. You need seed funding, then you need successive rounds, and we need collectively to have an infrastructure where the financing of policy activities in the way we were describing earlier is conducted in a way that is similar. And the problem is, of course, that there is not the feedback loop that you have in venture capital, where you can have an IPO, then you make a lot of money that comes into your pocket, and then you can fund other things. We don't have this for policymaking, and that's the major problem. But this should be more distributed.
Let me just highlight, if I may, the incentives that drive people away from cooperation for a bit. So when you talk about, we're going to have this nice IGF Plus in which the governments and the big corporations and civil society all come together, think about the political and economic incentives of let's say, a Raytheon Corporation and the U.S. defense establishment. So if they can convince their government that, Russian cyber attacks are threatening to bring down the entire U.S. critical infrastructure, and convince them to, number one, tax citizens to beef up the budget of the cybersecurity agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and then that cybersecurity agency offers a multi-million-dollar contract to Raytheon to develop the tools for cybersecurity, which are going to be kept secret and only given to the United States. What's going to happen? Do you think they're going to go to the IGF and say, let's do this with everybody? Or do you think they're going to go to that political environment, which they are very dominant in, and work within there?
I would like to add one thing that comes to mind as we're discussing this is there was a saying from Jean Monnet, who created the European Union, or the first regime in the European Union, and he said, nothing happens without humans and nothing stays without institutions. And what we are confronted with is that we're not paying enough attention to the governance of governance structures. What is emerging at the moment and needs to emerge, and it is a trend that is really interesting, is the emergence, just like the IETF, the RIRs, the ICANN, and all those institutions emerged on a need basis, not because somebody had a brilliant idea, but they said, okay, we need to bring people together and do this on a case-by-case basis, topic by topic. We're seeing the same thing at the moment. I don't know if you people in the audience have paid attention, but just in the last year and a half, we had the creation and institutionalization of the GIFCT, the Global Internet Forum for Terrorism. Counterterrorism, yeah. The Cyber Peace Institute that has been created in Geneva, and the oversight board of Facebook. Whatever we think about those organizations, and I personally think that it is a very interesting experimental space. We need to discuss what is the governance of those systems. What is the distribution of roles of the governments, the civil society, the private sector in the way they function? And it is going to be the main avenue for the future, the governance architecture for the next phases, datasphere or other topics, is going to be about dedicated institutions and how they function and how they interplay with each other. We need this protocol between autonomous governance systems that will organize this as a network and not as a unified and monolithic system. But the IGF is a very important one for the functions that Milton was mentioning.
I think you are talking a little bit about the COGOV governance model. It is the second option of the final report of the high-level panel. It's the idea of distributed policy networks with some kind of coordination structure, just so that they do not get loose from each other. But I had a second part of my previous question about you, Bertrand, you have this Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. So this is one of those policy incubators in this distributed scenario, distributed arena of policy making. Do you think, it seems you think this is a valuable way forward? Do you see already concrete results coming from those types of efforts? Is it possible that really the society, the companies, the governments buy the solutions that come out from those policy networks? For instance, I had also mentioned the various norms that were proposed by the Global Commission on the Stability of the Cyberspace and similar things. Do you really think that the community will be able to sell those ideas to the society, to the governments, to the company?
Well, Flavio, thank you for handing over an opportunity to make a quick pitch. This is exactly, there are a few lessons. One, you do not produce anything without an ongoing, iterative, dedicated process. It is not by a series of panels or sessions that you can solve the problem. You can frame the problem. You can help people understand what is at stake. But in order to produce anything, you need to have an ongoing process with the different actors. The second thing is, it only works if you choose the topics that are a sufficiently common problem. Encourage people from the onset, instead of looking at a problem that they have with each other, to see what is their common problem and what would be good if it were to be solved, and then make them work together. And the end result and the direct answer to your question is yes. And we have just released 2 weeks ago a series of toolkits that compile basically the outcomes of the work of the last 3 to 4 years in the different contact groups that we have done. It doesn't solve everything. It creates it proposes norms, criteria for decision making, and some mechanisms, and it is entirely voluntary. And we're seeing a certain amount of traction already. And the goal is to try to be very concrete, very, very, very concrete. I don't get into the details. I encourage people to go and have a look at the toolkits. It requires effort. And I can say today with much more confidence that yes, it is possible, but boy, it's a work.
Milton, some reaction to that?
Well, I think it's absolutely correct. I mean, again, from a social science point of view, that if you're going to build a policy network that produces innovations in governance mechanisms, you're going to have sustained effort over time. And I like the way he emphasizes the need to focus on common problems. Let me just emphasize that line that you cross when you're going from the open networking and non-binding discussions of the IGF into a formal institution with formalized forms of power, such as the RIR or ICANN or a national regulatory authority. Why do you move from one to the other? As in the first case, you have to have some kind of serious collective action problem, which requires the group in question to adopt common rules. Okay, so if you're going to have a global route to the naming system, you have to coordinate what goes into it. So there's no option other than to have some kind of a coordinated institutionalized process for deciding what names are in the top level of the route. Now, when you get to more complicated forms of policy making, such as, how do you do content moderation? That's not clearly the kind of problem that you're ever going to get a single coordinated global institution around, because of cultural differences and the power relations that are involved, everybody pulling in different directions. In those cases, you are best to deal with highly loose networked forms of cooperation. So there's an important distinction there between when you converge on formalized institutions with defined rules and a whole set of problems you get with that, like, financial sustaining, avoiding corruption, creating accountability, and these looser, more network forms of governance. I, again, am fairly optimistic about the capabilities of both of those forms of innovation to help us solve the problems of the internet. What I'm increasingly pessimistic about are the incentive structures created by the nation state system, which is keeping us locked into these territorial paradigms and these militaristic forms of conflict. I'm incredibly worried about where that is leading to us in the future.
So Bertrand, you mentioned the toolkits from the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. So, and bringing the discussion back a little bit to the Internet infrastructure and the critical resources. The Internet Society, from which I am the president of the Brazilian chapter, defined in 2020 a set of so-called critical properties, which would be essential for preserving the technical characteristics that explain the success of the Internet. An open network built upon common protocols based on a distributed, decentralized routing mechanism, based on sets of unique identifiers and being general purpose and technologically neutral. The Internet Society also proposed the Internet Impact Assessment Toolkit. So it's a set of resources that allows for the assessment of the impact of legislative and regulatory measures and new technologies on this set of critical properties. If we go back a little to another example, 2014, the Net Mundial event proposed a set of fundamental properties of the multi-stakeholder model of governance, a set of properties. Do you believe that the international internet governance community is able to reach consensus on the core properties of the internet and of its governance processes, and is also able to defend such consensus in different forums, and especially in intergovernmental ones? Do such definitions of key properties of the internet and its governance make sense? Is it worthwhile to make these definitions and try to defend those principles? This will help us in the way forward. What do you think?
Well, let me pick first. The Impact Assessment Toolkit by ISOC is a wonderful tool and a perfect illustration of what I was talking about when I was talking about the responsibilities when you have a transborder impact. This is one of the contributions that raises awareness about when a regulation is being made. Let's think about this. The second thing is, I believe that in spite of all the tensions that exist today, there is much more likelihood that the internet principles and the architecture will impact and transform the way traditional governance functions than the reverse. We might have, like after the 30 Years' War, two different coexisting religions or whatever. But I think in the debate, under one guise or another, the principles of free flow of data with sufficient protections, the principle of the distributed architecture, etc., is likely to become also the way we develop the new type of international cooperation mechanisms that are needed. It may take time. And honestly, when Milton and I were participating in the WISES, I would never have thought that 20 years later, we would still be at that stage. So it's the lack of problem. And in that regard, I want to finish with one thing. Flavio, you used the expression, the internet governance community. It used to be a very small community. It used to be what I call the net set. We were a small group of people traveling around the world when it was possible to travel, and actually meeting each other in the different places, but it was a very small group. And when I became the thematic ambassador for the French government, there were very few other thematic ambassadors for those issues, and I could coordinate with two ministries, Ministry of Industry and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Okay. Today, every single field is a concern. Every single ministry in every single country has something to do with digital and governance. And even more, when I was talking about the data sphere, every single sector being digitized is concerned by the question of how do you manage this? Agriculture, health, manufacturing, mobility, smart cities, everything is becoming a digital governance issue. not an internet governance issue in terms of the infrastructure, but a digital or data governance issue. And that makes the problem much more complex, but at the same time, there's a silver lining in there, because I believe that precisely because there are more and more and more actors, we need the protocol to interface between them. Because if you just organize 190 ambassadors, there's no problem. You get one room, 190 people, it's done. If you have, I don't know, 10 million people that you need to organize the interactions among, you need an architecture that can scale. And this is going to be the pressure that will bring the principles upon which the internet has been built, i.e. common protocol, voluntary, people get in, to win. And to take the word that Milton used, the reason why people joined the internet or joined the World Wide Web is because they were not only helping to participate in something, they were taking a benefit for themselves. And the problem today is we need to build in the incentives for the actors to want to participate in multi-stakeholder processes, because it will help them solve the problems that we are manifestly unable to solve with the existing system.
I would just like to amplify on your comment, Flavio. So I think I'm a little bit concerned about the Internet Society's tendency to try to turn what I see as political and social values into technical terms, and then define them as kind of a rigidly defined architecture that you must conform to technically. I think what you really want to say, or you really want to do, is protect the social values that the internet promoted, perhaps initially by accident or perhaps by design, but the point about it is not, some obscure technical principle of the way, packets are divided up or the way they're routed. What matters is that, it's open. It is not there's no prior restraint on who can join. The software is not proprietary, it's open source, which doesn't mean there can't be proprietary softwares or proprietary services, but the fundamental infrastructure is not. And then compatibility is a value that is, can be created in various ways. Technically, there's no one way to create compatibility. And freedom of expression and the importance of freedom of information to our concept of humanity, of liberal democracy. I think this is what you need to be emphasizing, and not trying to say, oh, this is technically wired in, or this is a technical principle. It really isn't. I mean, the internet protocols work in North Korea. They can be implemented in any country under any oppressive regime. Well, what matters is the social and political environment in which it is implemented.
So, thank you for your comments on that. Let's try to bring the discussion a little bit to the global south. So Brazil is one of the largest countries in the global south. The global south may have had little role in the international internet governance ecosystem. Still, some countries such as Brazil and India, due to their size, population, and regional influence, may have an important weight in the major global trends of internet development. Their local legislations and regulations, for example, can influence their respective continents. And in these two countries, we see recent attempts at legislation that may even damage the foundations of the internet. In a more technical dimension, in another example, judicial blockings of WhatsApp in Brazil have already had regional consequences caused by transnational borders of the autonomous systems. Do you believe that trends or events from the global south or at the global south can have global impact? Or is the global south doomed to a supporting role in this ecosystem? And I bring a related question from the audience, from Pedro de Perdigão Lana. He asked that considering the existence of digital colonialism, how can we avoid an excessive influence of traditional dominant countries or companies on the internet while minimizing the risks of fragmentation. Any thoughts on that?
Milton, you want to go?
Yeah, many thoughts on that. I think can the so-called global South become a leader? And I think it can if it hits upon certain policies and practices that allow the internet to flourish. I think too often what countries that are non-dominant try to do is to react in kind of a reactionary way to the dominance of the United States or Europe and increasingly China with protectionist measures. And I think they instead need to find a way to really thrive on the openness of the system and ways that take advantage of their unique characteristics and unique comparative advantages in the overall global system. So, for example, India, has gotten a lot more mileage out of being able to sort of outsource information services than it has gotten or ever will get from throwing up barriers to Chinese apps or American apps. So sometimes the whole dialogue of digital colonialism is actually kind of a reactionary thing that pushes the South into the same patterns of protection and regulation that kept them undeveloped in the first place. And this sort of tech nationalism, it's limiting enough when a gigantic country like China does it, but if a smaller Latin American country like Argentina or Chile does it, it's a dead end. You're not going to go anywhere with something like that. So there's no obvious way to do that, but I think you have to put a lot of emphasis on human capital, on the resourcefulness and capabilities of your people. And that means that they have to be in a free enough and open enough environment that they can make use of those capabilities without, having to seek permission from some bureaucrat somewhere who is really only interested in protecting their own bailiwick.
Maybe, Flavio, I would start by saying one thing, which is we're talking about states, we're talking about regions, talking about governments. But the reality is that there's a lot of impact that comes from people. And when I say people, I'm not only meaning the citizens. It can be individual people in a position of power or in a position of influence or in a position of facilitation. And we've seen in the US, has the US changed radically as a country between the presidency of Barack Obama, first black president, 4 years later, the presidency of Donald Trump, and then now the presidency of Joe Biden? Of course, there's much more continuity, but what I want to highlight is that in the question of who has influence in the debate, individuals matter. And individuals can be the Marcus Kummers or the Wolfgang Kleinwächter or the Milton Miller in the period of the WSIS, when a lot of the things that we are building on are being shaped. And it's not a matter of being just flattering. The role that CGI.br and NIC.br has played, and Hartmut in the organization of NetMundial, in the hosting of the IGFs, in the help for the summer school on internet governance, etc. That is a contribution that shows that the South and countries can produce things irrespective of what the government is doing at one point. In the course of the work that I mentioned earlier on the report on data, we have identified in Africa a network that I had never heard of before, which is called I4Policy, Innovation for Policy. This thing has started in 2018. It's a group of people, and they are spreading all over Africa to help multi-stakeholder discussions with the governments to shape legislation, etc. I believe in those things. This is not about a debate about global South, global North, etc. Yes, at the moment, The legislations are adopted in the US and in Europe mostly, and they are spreading because of extraterritoriality to other countries. But the key challenge is to find the spaces for those actors to participate in the discussions. And I want to say jokingly that the issue of digital colonialism is something that a senator in the French parliament has used to describe the relationship with American companies. So this is another example of an expression that can be used in so many ways to justify anything but finding solutions, if I may say so.
Thank you, Milton and Bertrand. So we already mentioned China many times. So we just talked about the role of the Global South and what is the role of China. So we know of the Great Firewall of China, all this geopolitical battle on technology with Europe and the US. How do you see in the future the role China can have on this whole debate? One of our the audience, Jacqueline Pigato, asked about, for instance, the influence the World Internet Conference of China could have on the global internet governance facing attempts to reshape IGF. Do you think China will play the game in this network of policy incubators, in these efforts of the multi-stakeholder model, or will China just follow its way, in an independent way? So,
well, that's a very,
how do you feel about China?
Yeah. So China, you cannot have a totally monolithic view of it. So there are people in the industry and in academia, and we can't really say civil society. In fact, the Communist Party does not allow its academics to use the word civil society. They consider it to be a non-Marxist concept. But there could be an autonomous Chinese civil society, and the industry, the people in the industry there and in academia who follow internet governance are very interested in global participation in the multi-stakeholder system. They may have the differences about specific regulatory issues. But then you have another problem. The problem in China is, in fact, the monopoly of one party on the political system, and this has profound impacts. So the pattern of China has been, we're going to develop by allowing some freedom. That's why they started developing after 1979. They had started allowing property rights, markets, accumulation of capital, enterprise, and entrepreneurialism. And then they once they succeed, they crack down and they control it. So you see that happening now with the big platforms, with Alibaba and with Tencent. You see them, they were developing, they became kind of a threat to the dominance of the government and the party, and suddenly they're being reined in. So the problem with China is that you can't write it off as being this monolithic authoritarian state that you just try to shut out. On the other hand, because their companies are good and innovative, and they have lots of entrepreneurs and lots of good scientists and engineers there, and they want to be part of the global economy. And there's millions of students who come to Europe and the United States to get educated. I think also in Latin America, you'll find Chinese students going to your universities, and perhaps vice versa. So it's a very difficult situation. The question is, how do you relate to, how does a liberal democratic system relate to a one-party system that actually is willing to trade with it? And this is, in fact, the issue that we're taking up with our workshop in the summer. It's called, comparative analysis of competing systems of political economy. And we want to investigate that from kind of a scientific point of view. So I can't come up with any magic formula for handling this relationship, but I think the first thing we have to do is understand it. We have to understand how it works, where are the areas. Bertrand likes to talk about compatibility between policy systems and legal systems. What are the incompatibilities? We know, what happened in Hong Kong is extremely enlightening. It's very clear that China is not going to allow the one country, two systems model to continue, that they are systematically wiping out the vestiges of democracy and free speech in that territory. So we should have no illusions about the kind of system that the Communist Party prefers. But at the same time, these are signs of weakness rather than strength. They are really afraid of allowing these kinds of freedom. And I think that the global system is going to be pressing against those boundaries quite a bit. And I think that the main characteristic of China is simply the scale of their domestic economy is so big that it gives them a lot of influence, just as the United States did, and just as Europe is trying to do and has succeeded to some extent in doing. So again, that's why I look at this as being this trilateral relationship between these three big power blocks, and I think that's what's going to be driving the nature of internet governance or digital governance worldwide, is how these three systems relate to each other.
I must confess that I'm not a huge specialist of China, and it is a real big question mark. I completely agree with the non-monolithic nature and the diversity. I mean, it's an enormous country with a lot of people on all sides of the spectrum, and I'm sure that even within the Communist Party, there are trends internally that are going in one direction, and intense discussions, I'm sure. What I see as a major problem, as I was listening to Milton, is the challenge of engagement. Because there is a position, China has the luxury of playing on a lot of different chessboards at the same time. It's playing the UN approach, where there is a sort of automatic majority because of a lot of past reasons, and also the extremely strong relations that it is building in Africa. When you talk to African people, they say that they are scared of the situation of being caught between two opposing models that will ask to choose which one. And Europe is hoping to be the one in the middle that can say, no, you don't have to choose, just choose us. But this is just geopolitics. The thing is that China has a lot of leverage in the multilateral system. It's totally coherent with their position of sovereignty, that is the state, the responsibility of the state, and their main objective is to leverage this environment, which is perfectly fair. Everybody has tried to have leverage and alliance in the international system. But at the same time, the economic power is putting in visibility, in the spotlight, the whole question of dependency of supply chains at the moment. And what I was describing as the growing mistrust is fascinating and dangerous, because we are now in an environment where what was taken for granted in terms of outsourcing for the whole infrastructure, Apple manufacturing everything over there, global sourcing, etc., is now in jeopardy because of the growing mistrust on the geopolitical level. And at the same time, in terms of the influence and the desire to shape the architecture, China has the most connected and networked approach in terms of interrelations at the international level with all actors that any other country in the world. And the extent of the relationship and the sort of the web of relationships that China is developing, also because it has a lot of people who can go and build the relationships with others, is fascinating. So coming back to my point to finish, I'm not familiar with China sufficiently. It's a fascinating country. But what I think is that we're all placed, and they are placed, in a conundrum of engagement, because you cannot make engagement without preconditions, and there's no agreement on the preconditions that would allow engagement. And at the moment, we're a little bit, there's an expression in French that says, se regarder en chien de faïence. Chien de faïence is a dog in a ceramic. and you get the two dogs, and they're just watching at each other. In the background, they're fighting, but the two dogs are just looking at each other. And at the moment, I think we are really missing the spaces for engagement, things that may be alternative environments, connections that will be more without prerequisites, but without concession. And that's the tricky one. How can you do, let's sit down and really think about what are the common problems without putting a veil over the things that are problematic and are unacceptable. And this debate is, I don't have a solution for that, but I think more personal contacts is probably necessary. Unfortunately, the current pandemic is limiting even more the opportunity for just the personal interactions with people, and that's, I think, damaging.
Yeah, this is something interesting to see how it will develop in the future, because with its size and its growing influence, the new Silk Road and the influence in Africa and things like that. So China is a too big player to be left outside this network of policy incubators, all these efforts from the global community to come up with solutions to the many problems we have in internet governance.
But as Milton said, there may be frailties that we do not see. Just like we have our own frailties in the West and so on, but there may be things that are less resilient or that may encourage an evolution. We don't know.
Right. I think they have depended so much for their growth and innovation on openness and market economics. And then they clamp down, and at some point, they're going to lose that tendency to clamp down is going to destroy the innovative and dynamic elements of their economy, and they won't be competitive. And what bothers me is the way the United States is imitating Chinese tactics. So we're going to subsidize our semiconductor manufacturers because China is. We're going to create a firewall to block their apps because they're blocking our apps. If Europe and the US get into this game of reciprocal barriers, I think it's a very bad thing.
I'd just maybe add one thing on China. China is a unique case in the world in terms of size, in terms of having the same writing system, even if they have several languages. I mean, we may have the same alphabet in Europe, but we have 27 or 20 languages and nobody understands them among them. And it's the only entity that has on its own a size sufficient to be a market with its own capacity. And it is difficult even for countries in Europe that claim to have 1,000 to 1,000 years of history, let alone the United States with 200 plus, to understand what it means to have the feeling of 5,000 years of history. And when you look at the history of China, not going back to the traditional example of Amiral Zheng in the 12th or 13th century, where China was going all around the world with 6-mast ships up to the coast of Africa. And then afterwards, when the emperor changed, the whole thing was, or when the admiral died, the whole thing was retracting and reconcentrating on the l'Empire du Milieu, as we say in French, the empire of the middle. And so I wouldn't bet it is impossible for China to have reached now a sort of critical mass of self-ignition, if you see the nuclear analogy. I mean, it is a reaction that can be sustained on its own. It depended a lot on the external trade. It may not be completely the same in the future, but at the same time, as the level of development continues in the country, there might be aspirations to keep the relationship with the rest. I don't know what the trends are. The future is clearly not written in my mind.
So we are talking big players, and we are approaching also the end of our panel. We have a little more than 10 minutes left. So I would like to bring another big player to the discussion, and then you can talk a little bit about them, and then already give your last impressions, your last thoughts and contributions to this debate. And this big player are the big platforms. Mm-hmm. So that Amazon and Microsoft and Google and Facebook, we all know. So there are many complaints on the way the big platforms act in this ecosystem. So they act in many cases beyond the regulation capacity of states and society. Is it possible to bring these corporations to debate the policies and principles in this ecosystem we are talking about, if they act in most cases in a kind of transpolitical field beyond politics? What do you think about the way those big platforms are taking part of these internet governance discussions and shaping the future of this?
Well, I think that platforms are very much are engaged in a debate with the global community over their governance, and the vehicles for that debate are antitrust laws or competition policy laws. Europe has been applying antitrust laws to the big platforms since 2010, I think, you know, the issue of content moderation, it seems like maybe that's just my US perspective, but it seems like the whole world is talking about nothing else most of the time and putting way too much emphasis on the capability of the platforms. We have this sort of dual look at them. We complain about them being too powerful and too all-encompassing, and at the same time, we blame them for not suppressing any deviant political movement or deviant actor who might go out and kill people. We want them to be our guardians against any kind of social deviance because we believe, mostly mistakenly, that if it's allowed to be expressed somewhere on a platform, then it's going to somehow take over the world. We have these crazy ideas being circulated that the platforms are responsible for violent extremism, or that the Capitol Hill riots of January 6th never would have happened if it weren't for Facebook. These are some really bad, bad theories of media influence on society. However, these are indeed powerful new forms of social interaction. They are high scale, large and concentrated. At least in the US, I think the platform economy is a lot more diverse than people realize. Even though Facebook is dominant and Google is dominant, I think that there are all kinds of little creatures nibbling around the edges of their market at all times. And we saw, for example, the international competition between platforms. So the entry of TikTok in the United States was a very interesting and significant development. And of course, one of the reasons TikTok started getting flagged as being risky and Chinese was because of Facebook doing that in its lobbying in Washington. So I do see I think it's inevitable that the dominance, the concentration of a few big platforms will decline, and that we will develop ways of sort of decentralizing that power, possibly through some legal means, but in most cases through market mechanisms by which simply new forms of interaction come up, and old monopolies are displaced by new monopolies. I think we need to stop assigning. You know, there's a real danger, I think, in our approach to the platforms and the issue of content moderation, in that people are so concerned about deviant and potentially harmful forms of expression taking place on platforms that they are advocating in effect, a totalitarian approach to speech regulation. They're saying, you know, it's dangerous that a bunch of people can get together on Telegram and have a community exchanging ideas, and they could be saying the wrong things and plotting, you know, to riot or something, or to kill, to be racist or something like that. And of course, it's true that those kinds of things can happen, but they could always happen in one way or the other. And the idea that the platform control, surveillance, and censorship is going to save us from all social deviance, I think is a really dangerous idea. I think we have to accept the fact that the platforms make all of this stuff transparent, so we can see it going on where we couldn't see it as easily before. And that has good things about it, as well as bad things, but mostly good things. I would bring to your attention the case of Ahmaud Arbery, which is right here in Georgia. I don't know if you know who that was, but he was like a black teenager who was like jogging through a white neighborhood. And essentially, he was murdered. He was just killed because they were afraid of him going through their neighborhood. And nothing happened for 3 months. Basically, the people who did it, they knew there was a killing. They sort of covered it up locally. And then somebody released the videotape of the killing onto the social media. And suddenly, you know, all hell broke loose. Everybody was pointing fingers. How did this happen? What can we do about these people? Why was no action taken? The local police chief, you know, had to be changed, and a prosecution took place at the state level and in the federal level. So a lot of reform took place because of the exposure of social media, as well as bad things happening place, you know, because of social media.
Flavio, I think you are throwing such an interesting question. I would like to ask, do you have another 2 hours so that we can the whole thing? Because that
you have 5 minutes.
I know. So jokes aside, there are a few things. There are many things to say about this. One, it is an example of the tech backlash that I was talking about earlier. And now there's the pendulum swing in a direction that I must say is also largely fed by the traditional media as well, because anything in the traditional media that can explain that the internet, which is killing them, is actually a very dangerous thing because it promotes very, 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 very bad things, is not only newsworthy and attracting attention, but also serving the purpose of demonizing it a little bit. I'm caricaturing, but there's an element in that. We only see what is going wrong at the moment. I made a calculation looking at the transparency report of Facebook. The problem is that we're not accustomed to having to deal with enormous numbers. The proportion of the things that are taken down by Facebook in terms of hate speech, nudity, you name it, all their community guidelines, is less than 0.2% of the amount. So it's very small. The problem is that the absolute volume is enormous because it's in the millions of posts, and we're not familiar at all with this thing. The second thing quickly is there is a Faustian bargain that is going on at the moment. The governments believe that asking the companies, the platforms, to do their job is actually alleviating their task. So they don't want to have the 20,000 people that China had at one point. So they're just happy that Facebook is hiring 20,000 people to do the content moderation. The problem is that this may actually reinforce the role and the control by the platforms. But in doing so, there's a Faustian bargain for the governments, but there's a Faustian bargain for the companies. Because now they're responsible for such an amount of things that any single court decision around the world is actually setting a precedent for their whole activity. So at one point, this is the 30 years war that I was talking about. They need, with civil society and international organizations and whoever, to come to a table to really understand what is the distribution of responsibilities. And in that regard, we are exploring, and we'll be doing this year in the content and jurisdiction track, the notion of regulation of platforms, regulation by platforms, and regulation on platforms. By platforms is the terms of service. On platforms is the moderators of forums, for instance, on Facebook or things like that. And of platforms is what comes from regulation from governments. But I think the bottom line is we are now in an environment where there is normative plurality. It is a fact of life, and Milton was talking about it. There is a harmonization function through the terms of service. And when you look at the right to be de-indexed or the right to be forgotten, it is fascinating that the highest court, and I finish with that, the highest court in Europe has chosen to entrust the balancing of the right to access information and the right to privacy to not only a private company, but a private company that is not even a European. And the notion that Google is in charge of balancing the right to be de-indexed, or Bing for that matter, is a fascinating evolution in the distribution of responsibilities. And until the different actors agree that there is a new distribution of roles, which is actually the real implementation of the multi-stakeholder approach, we will continue to have this arm twisting that will have no winner and a lot of losers, because the citizens and democracy and the internet as a whole is going to be the victim. So,
unfortunately, it is 5 p.m. here in Brazil. We have to come to the end of this panel. I must thank you very much, Bertrand and Milton, on behalf of the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, for the wonderful debate, for your thoughts and insights. As Bertrand said, we could keep talking 2 hours more. There are many other issues around questions of cyber sovereignty and transnational questions and jurisdiction and related to the internet infrastructure and so on, so that we could still talk about those issues. But I think we had a very interesting debate. The video will stay here in the YouTube channel of the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, so that people will be able also to access the video and see the debate later on if they were not able to follow the debate now in the middle of the afternoon here in Brazil. And I thank you really very much to you both for being with us during these 2 hours. So thank you, Milton. Thank you, Bertrand, for the wonderful debate. And so hope to see you again in maybe a next debate
time,
here
next
in
time
Brazil.
in real space.
And don't hesitate to go to the Internet Intersection website to download the toolkits, the report on We Need to Talk About Data, and contact us if you want to talk about the data sphere and its governance. And thank you.
Okay.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
So, thank you. Bye-bye. Bye all. Thank you to our audience that was here with us. So, bye-bye, everyone.